why did I write it? Is that right? So
Yes.
well, as you've probably been told, this was something like my 44th book. So it's a very good question. Why would I write another one? Why would I write this one? But the real reason is that having worked for more than 30 years now in sustainability, I'm always trying to push the leading edge, because if what we're doing isn't working, if we're trying to treat a patient and the patient is the earth and society and it's not getting better, then we need to try something different. But the main thing was that so many of the books I was reading, so many of the documentaries I was watching were all about the problems, and those that were about what companies, what business was doing, I wasn't convinced were bringing a solution that was equal to the problems. And my view is that innovation has a big role to play. We need a transformative approach. And when I speak to people about that, they're always unconvinced. And that's not surprising, because we are immersed in the news headlines, in our social media feeds, and there's plenty of bad news out there. And there's plenty of science that suggests that we have some really challenging problems. But it seemed to me nobody was really capturing what was going on in the innovation space that should give us hope. And so that's really why I decided to write the book. I always write books to make sense of what I'm learning. And so you will have noticed there was a lot of my own experiences in there, and my own thinking as it evolved and developed. But that's really the reason, is to invite people to be on this building of a movement journey. But more than that, probably to give people some evidence, some examples that they can feel that, as another author, Hannah Ritchie, puts it, it's not the end of the world. Actually, we are making progress, and in some cases, very rapid progress. And we have many of the solutions, and it's a question of scaling them. So that's more or less why.
And you called your book Thriving, but I thought you originally had another name in mind, no?
Yes, there is a little story behind that, which I probably shared with you before. I was going to call it Regeneration. I mean, what one senses when you're researching and writing is whether there are new waves that are building. And it's been clear to me for quite a while that, sustainability as usual may have reached its limits. It hasn't been effective. You probably all know that John Elkington, who came up with the triple bottom line, did a withdrawal of that concept 25 years after he introduced it in an article in the Harvard Business Review. He withdrew it he did a management concept recall, not to say that we need to kill it off, but that we really need to question whether it's been effective. And so, I was observing a wave building, which is around this idea of not only doing less harm, but regeneration, doing something that's, as Paul Polman and Andrew Winson call it, net positive. And so I'd basically written the whole book, framing it as regeneration. I think it's a good concept. I like it. And then I asked John Elkington to do the foreword, and he was happy to do that. But then he said, you do know that Paul Hawken, who's another big name in sustainability, is just about to come out with a book called Regeneration. So then I got hold of Paul Hawken and I said, okay, we've got something similar coming out, but let's not compete. Let's rather complement each other. And so I changed mine to Thriving. And, you know, he comes at it from a different angle. It's also a fantastic book if you haven't read it, Regeneration. And in retrospect, I don't regret it, because one of the problems we've had with sustainability is that it's very much a jargon concept, right? It's a name, it's a label we've invented. Most people, you know, their eyes glaze over when they hear sustainability. And there are problems with the concept itself that I explain in the book. But when I think about it now, regeneration has a little bit of the same flavor. It's a kind of jargon word, and it's been a bit captured by the agricultural movement, regenerative agriculture. Whereas thriving is just an ordinary English word. We use it in lots of different contexts, and people know what it means. In fact, when I was writing the book under the title Regeneration, and I did a sort of Google search to make sure that nobody had published under that title, a lot of what comes up is about people and animals regrowing their limbs after they've been chopped off, you know, regeneration of body parts, you know. So it really means different things to different people. Thriving, everybody gets it. If I say, you know, how would you like to thrive in your life, or what would it mean for your family to thrive, or your city, or your country, people know what that means. And so it's kind of a jargon buster, and I like it for that reason.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna turn to the audience immediately and ask the audience for questions. So who's first? Yeah.
Feeling about the title Thriving.
Can you hear her properly?
Softly, but carry
we
on.
have no mic here, so
You can always repeat if I don't get it.
Stand up and speak from my belly. Can you hear me?
Nice projection.
you come a
yes,
bit closer. That's okay. You can come closer also. And introduce you briefly. So.
Yeah, hello. My name is see me because Amina Langendijk. I worked also in sustainability in the past for the minerals industry, now in leadership and coaching. The word thriving for me is it's very connecting. There is this emotional connection to it. So I think it's excellent. And I think it's also, for what I read from the book and what you were saying about giving hope and the idea about really bringing those positive case studies, bringing forward the innovation that is happening in these domains. People need to see that and to also, I think, to connect, to have that inspiration, to have that idea. So I just wanted to give you this feedback that I'm really enthusiastic, but there's so much content in the book. I was like, oh my God, and the experiences. So it's very, very rich. So I just wanted to give you the feedback and I feel the movement behind it and the hope that it's bringing. And I think that will stir a lot of minds and engage a lot of people, because it's purposeful. There's a purpose behind it, and to give some direction. Where should we be heading? What is already happening? And I think indeed creating a movement and bringing people together, like what we are doing here, like the whole EBBC also spirit, will probably this is something that will grow.
Okay, so the first interaction was not a question, but a compliment.
It's a great feedback. I really appreciate that. And I just like that you've picked up on the hope message, because one of the things you'll find as you yourselves, I hope, become ambassadors for Thriving, not specifically the book, but the movement, is you'll encounter a lot of skepticism, even cynicism. Basically, people don't like us to be too positive, right? Because they're also immersed in the problems and get it on their screens every day. And so you all need to figure out, and I hope the book helps with that, you know, what are credible reasons to be hopeful? Because we're not interested in blind optimism or false hope, right? This has to be grounded in what's really possible, what's happening, changes that are being made. And for me, part of the answer is, of course, all of those examples of innovations that are already happening, which I tried to capture. But, you know, a bigger part of the answer is that change is not a linear process. And not too many people really get that. When we live our lives, it seems, even though the world seems to be speeding up, mostly things seem to change slowly, or at least in a predictable way. But we know that that's not particularly how complex systems change. So this idea of tipping points, that you can get to an inflection point after years and years of almost nothing happening, lots of resistance to change, and then you get into the exponential part of that curve, and suddenly it happens very, very fast. And, you know, I share in the book my example or my experience from South Africa. You know, that was 40 years of resistance to change, a very violent resistance to change. And then when the change happened, it all happened within 5 years, and the, you know, the political situation was completely transformed. And so that's part of what gives me the most hope, is, you know, trying to track these trends as they're going, emerging technologies. In fact, the next book I'm working on is on 10 technologies that I believe will transform the world. And, you know, realizing that even if we get the resistance, and in fact, the resistance is a sign that things are changing. The sort of anti-lobbies that we get, whether that's from the meat industry or the fossil fuel industry or others, you know, everything that's going on with anti-ESG, you know, the woke capitalism stuff, all of that is a sign that things are changing, and that those that have the current power are threatened. So that's another great source of hope. And the last piece of that puzzle for me is that hope is an attitude as well, as is optimism. It's just, to be hopeful is a more productive and enjoyable way to be in the world. And it's not baseless. I think I quote Rebecca Solnit in the book. She's got a wonderful little book. She writes for The Guardian. She's an American, but if you haven't read her little book called Hope in the Dark, I really recommend it. It's about how social movements happen. And she writes beautifully, very poetically. And she makes the point that the reason why we can always be hopeful, even in the darkest of times, is because nothing stays the same. The world changes constantly. So even if you're in the worst situation, you know, not only can it change, it will change. And of course, we want to try to nudge it to change in the right direction. She's got this wonderful quote. I hope it's in the book. I might have only discovered it afterwards, but she says, you know, hope is not like a lottery ticket that you sit on the sofa and clutch, feeling lucky. Hope is an axe you break down doors with in an emergency. And of course, we are facing an emergency. And so hope is one of those tools on our side.
Wow, thank you. The room is silent now. Next question. Who wants?
Was there one specific event or moment that inspired or triggered him to write the book? Was there one specific thing?
There were 3.
Heard you loud and clear. Thank you. I mean, to be honest, it built slowly. You know, if you like, the intellectual foundations of it and the frameworks that I elaborate, the 6 transitions and the integrated value management and all of that, you know, was probably 10 years in the making. And so, you know, if you want to say, was there a moment, it was probably in 2012. So it goes back a long way. You know, I'd been working a lot on corporate social responsibility and trying to change that movement. And I'd written about CSR 2.0, that's transformative CSR. And I just felt it wasn't catching on, let's say. I mean, the CSR had too much baggage. And so I thought, well, let's try this a different way. I remember I was in, where was I? I was in a German city, and I am trying to remember which one, but I was in a park somewhere in Germany, and I just had a couple of hours to myself, and I just thought, okay, how do we do this differently? And I thought the way to do it is to start with what is it that people will all agree on, and obviously I was thinking about the future. So what is the kind of future that everybody will say, yes, we want that? And, I distilled it down to the fact that we want a safe or secure future. We want one that's shared, we feel included. We want one that's sustainable environmentally. Now, at the time it happened, we were dealing with the Lisbon agenda in Europe. So I didn't just make those things up. Sort of shared, sustainable, and smart were already the competitive strategy for Europe. So I thought, well, those three make a lot of sense. Smart being, of course, technologically connected. But I did feel that what was missing was secure. People want to feel safe. They want to feel, that they're not in danger. They're not at risk. And I felt as well that there was a piece missing on crises. How do we deal with one crisis after another? And so that became the future fit sort of framing of these issues, which is originally the sort of 5 S's of future fitness. Then Future Fit Business Benchmark popped up in London as an organization and began with their standard independently, as far as I can tell. I've spoken to their founder, and again, I just sort of agreed not to compete. It's like, let's not confuse people by using the same terminology. But I didn't want to let go of that idea that, we need to start with the future that we want, that everybody can agree with, and work backwards. Now, these days we call that backcasting. And it just evolved and evolved since then, just being fleshed out. Eventually it went from 5 elements to 6 elements, because I realized when I talked about the environmental issues, everybody went straight to the circular economy, which is good. We need that. But somehow they therefore were really neglecting the biodiversity piece and the ecosystems piece. And in my mind, that's probably one of the most serious problems that we face, and one which we're really not getting to grips with yet. And so anyway, it evolved. So, it's moments like those, moments of reflection, but the actual turning that into a coherent narrative, that comes out in the end as thriving, can take years, because you end up also testing it on people. I'm lucky that I do a lot of public speaking. I do a lot of lecturing as well. And so I just test these things out and see what resonates. And more you see that, this idea of net positive, regeneration, thriving, flourishing is another word for it, it resonates with people. But you can't just put it out there as an idea with no substance, because then it's a bit like systems thinking, right? When I got into sustainability, everyone said to me, the most important thing is systems thinking. So I said, okay, well, what is that? What does that mean? And they would tell me, well, it means everything's connected. I said, well, great. What do I do with that? You have to build in layers of substance behind these things and methodologies to actually turn them into action. And I guess that's what takes the time. And then you've got to find the cases, the examples of the pioneers that are really doing it. So, I mean, I think the other critical moment, I don't know if it was an aha moment, but I confessed this right at the end of the book, so you may remember. But I'd basically written the book already, or at least half of the book, 50,000 words, probably more than half. And I managed to delete my hard drive on my laptop and in the cloud completely with all my files. So, of course, I had lots of other files as well, but probably most critical was that manuscript. And so I had to start again. And I think it's a better book as a result, because when I was originally writing it, it was very, I don't want to say academic, but very detailed and very analytical. And when I stepped back, then I thought, well, that might fail the test of storytelling. And so what did I do? I'd been writing every day for 2.5 years, 100 words a day, which I would post on LinkedIn. Just every day I challenged myself to say, what is happening in the world that's good, in this space that's inspiring or perhaps is challenging, and can I write it, capture it in 100 words? So what I actually did, because this was also how Thriving was bubbling up, is I started then with all of that writing. I sort of took that as my foundation, and that was a lot more. There was a lot more storytelling in there, a lot more examples, a lot more of the inspirational stuff, rather than the, let's say, the academic side. So yeah, key moment, and I think better for it.
Good question. Wayne, I also remember that you were almost a philosopher instead of someone doing things with business. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, well, I guess I still try to be, but it's true that when I was at school, I was at a stage, and I think many young people are when they're growing up. I mean, you're trying to figure out your place in the world and in the universe. In fact, you're trying to figure out what life is for. And I was very involved first with the church, but then I fell out with the church because I became interested in other religions besides Christianity. And that was kind of a no-no, according to the church. So I got into comparative religion in my reading, and then into philosophy. And so I was seriously considering studying philosophy or religious studies at university. And then my headmaster of my high school basically said, you know, forget it. You'll never have a career as a, in that, if you do a Bachelor of Arts, let alone in philosophy. And I did already have an interest in business, very naive interest in business, because I'd started up a few businesses while I was still a young school pupil. I'd started up one business where I was selling chocolates, which I would sort of make at home, mold and make at home. And I was selling jewelry, which I was sort of making myself. So I quite liked this idea of enterprise, of entrepreneurship. So I thought, well, maybe that's my other option. And of course, the headmaster said, yes, go for that. Particularly because my parents didn't have money to send me to university, and I needed to get a scholarship if I was going to be able to go. And he said, yeah, you stand a chance of getting a scholarship if you study business rather than philosophy. And that turned out to be the case. I got the scholarship and studied business. But as a result, all the way through those business studies, I was constantly trying to link it back to philosophy, which was a lot about, ethics, a lot about, values. And even at the time, I don't know how it manifested in Europe. I was in South Africa at the time, but there was this kind of what became known as the New Age movement, which was a lot about studying consciousness. And there was a wonderful book called The Aquarian Conspiracy by Marilyn Ferguson, which was all about, brain-mind research into consciousness. And I was trying to link all of these things and trying to say how do I link that to business, because that was what I was studying. And it was just at the time that we were sort of getting into the lead up. So I started my business studies the year after sustainable development was first coined, which was 1987, the Brundtland Commission and the Brundtland definition. And so sustainability was sort of just in the air, starting to take hold. And they'd set the date for the Rio Earth Summit of 1992. And so all of my business studies were in the lead up to the Rio Earth Summit. And I got involved in an economics and commerce students organization called ISEC, and they ended up sending me to these various conferences as South African representative, one of which was a global conference in Japan on business and sustainability. And it was meant to be the youth's voice. I write about this, so I shouldn't duplicate what you've already read. But the point being that I realized that probably my best way to combine this interest in philosophy with business was to use sustainability as the vehicle, even though I maintained a strong interest more in the sort of consciousness side and the sort of philosophy and ethics side. I think it became much more concrete when you brought it down and talked about sustainable business. So that's the way the career went.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, good evening. First of all, thank you for accepting the invitation and for sharing this conversation with us. My name is Juan, and I would like to ask a question to bring a practical opportunity to discuss with you. I come from a very technical background in a field and in an industry that is very conservative, but it's very polluting, and that needs solution immediately. One of the things that you said is that one of the challenges that you consider for pushing sustainability is regarding upscaling. I do feel the same. I hope not to be wrong with your wording, but I do feel the same, and I feel that, for instance, in my industry, in the industry that I work in,
which is
cement industry.
Cement
industry.
Concrete.
So bringing solutions to upscale, it's actually it's a challenge. It's a burden. So how would you address this kind of challenge to bring solutions to upscale in the cement industry, for instance, or in a conservative industry in general?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I'm an optimist, I'm a possibilist, but I'm also a pragmatist, right? We have to get to where we need to go to from where we are. And where we are is that we have many industries that are part of the problem, and probably through no fault of their own. It's just this is how we've industrialized, and particularly climate change has become a problem almost by accident, let's say. And nobody thinks or nobody should think that it's easy. This is another industrial revolution. So, how do you deal with that? Let me start a little bit general, and then I'll try and get specific on cement. I've worked with many businesses around the world. And what I realized, particularly in my work as a consultant with Capgemini and KPMG and others, which, by the way, we were working with very conservative companies, including, I heard you earlier mention the mining industry. I did a lot of work with the mining industry, with the chemicals industry, and with others, including actually with the cement industry. And, one of the things I realized is, yes, they're conservative. Yes, they have all of these market pressures. But none of the leaders that I spoke to wanted to be left behind, wanted to feel that they were losing the competitive race. And so one of the techniques I used always was basically benchmarking, is finding out what others in their industry are doing that are doing it better. and of course with a sustainability lens. So how is it that your competitor can do things that are more sustainable, still perform well economically, financially, and leave you behind, and there's that kind of ego that kicks in with leaders, that they just don't want to feel that they are not the best, or not at least striving to be the best. So that even works in conservative industries. Then if I think of, some of those, like chemicals, like fossil fuels that I've done a lot of work with, like mining metals, I think you can go quite a long way with arguing the business case. And there is a little section in the book where I distill that into the 10 R's of, return on thriving, if you like, or return on regeneration. But you could basically pick all of those 10 arguments and create a narrative and evidence behind them. And whether that's about risk management, which is often a good place to start, or about resource efficiency, another good place to start, because there you get, cost savings. Reputation is one that particularly CEOs probably care the most about. Research that's been done on why CEOs are doing sustainability, that comes out number one. It's about reputation. We think it's about, financial profits and so on, but actually they care a lot about their brand. And so you could go through all 10 of those. I won't go through them now. So really working hard on what's the business case for doing sustainability, advancing it. Then there's a point about how you frame it as a journey of change. And I think one of the mistakes that the activists make, sometimes I also consider myself an activist, is that we know where we need to get to. We know how urgent it is to move fast, how bad the problems are, and so on. And so we're impatient. We want things to change tomorrow, because every day, every week, every year that we wait, things get worse. And so we tend to frame it. And I don't know, they're in the room, if any of you are part of the Extinction Rebellion movement.
Anyone? No, they've been here in this room.
Yeah. So, I think they're doing an interesting thing, and really are challenging and disrupting and so on. And we have others like, what is it, Just Stop Oil, I think, here as well. We've had people put in jail for 5 years here in the UK just for planning a protest. But what activists sometimes get wrong is they frame it as, if you're not changing tomorrow, if you're not immediately stopping fossil fuels, if you're not, being very bold, then you're basically part of the problem. And I think what you have to do pragmatically is just to say, yes, we absolutely need to change, but you've got time. This is not a quick fix. It's going to take, probably a generation, but for companies, you want to talk in 10-year horizons. So, what could you do in 10 years? I do a lot of scenario work with companies, and the reason I use scenarios is because, firstly, the timeline is longer. Normally scenarios are anything between 10 and 50 years. And that just frees people up, because they're not already caught into, their current role and the accountabilities that they might have. They can imagine a little bit an alternative. And so framing the change as a journey, that, okay, and let's face it, I mean, let's talk now about concrete or cement. They have actually signed up, as of almost every industry, to the net zero commitments on climate change. That's 2050, which is a little bit too far because then you just kick the can down the road. But in theory, at least, they've made the commitment. And what you need to do then is to say you've got, what could be possible within 10 years. And then the final point is you have to show people in the industry that it's possible and ultimately profitable. There's a formula, I think I do share it in the book, which I use often when I'm talking about change. It's Beckard's formula for change. And he says for change to happen, you have to overcome resistance to change. And resistance is R in the formula. And R, the resistance to change, must be less than a combination of 3 factors. V, which is for vision. So you have to be very clear on an inspiring future. And then you've got F, which is first steps. And this is the bit I'm talking about. You have to show that it's possible. You have to, show that there are cases out there of the transition. And interestingly, just to finish that thought, the third factor in that formula is D for dissatisfaction with the status quo. I'll come back to that because I think that's one we really struggle with in sustainability. But in the case of concrete now, of cement, we actually do have some companies that are showing that you can have, vastly reduced carbon footprints on cement if you make it differently. You can have green cement, you can use hydrogen in the process, you can explore lots of alternatives. And so you have to show that there is a pathway to transform, and that, ultimately those that do that will be the ones that win through the transition. The transition is non-negotiable, but the winners and losers will still be determined. Just let me pick up on that last point, which is a more general point. I often feel that dissatisfaction with how things are is our strongest barrier. What do I mean by that? For most people, they don't think things are so bad, right? They're probably living a fairly comfortable life. They don't want to give things up. They don't want to make sacrifices. They don't want to be inconvenienced. And then even if we look to developing countries, emerging economies, where we say, well, surely it's bad there, right? People are still living in poverty, whatever. They're actually, for most of them, their lives are getting better. They're emerging out of poverty. So why would they want to change whatever trajectory they're on? And certainly, why would they want to deny themselves having what we have in the rich west and north of the world? So, to get change to happen, we have to work hard on kind of seeding that dissatisfaction to say, really, things are not okay. People start to feel pain, of course, through climate events, economically, through geopolitical unrest and so on. But we really have to convince people that they need to change because their life will get better. And that's a storytelling challenge we've largely failed in sustainability. We haven't really convinced people that a sustainable future is better. Sounds crazy to say that, but that's a failure of communication on our part.
A lot of nodding going on here, so people do agree. So you can go back to your CEO and give him some advice, work on his ego, and then ask for benchmarks and try to get it working. Thank you. I think that certainly helps.
Yeah, thank you.
Other questions? Yeah, you're in the front.
Hi, so I'm Michael. We met, I think, like 10, 15 years ago somewhere. We had a small restaurant at Lagerplatz. We had a dinner together.
Nice.
And unfortunately, I haven't read your book yet, but I wonder, listening to the stories now, to what extent does the whole book relate to what has been around for, like, I think, 20, 30 years on transition theory and transition management? Because we talk about systems innovations, we talk about providing good examples, working with resistance, against resistance. If resistance comes up, then it's a good sign normally. How do we work with power? So could you relate a bit on that, on how it relates to transition management as such?
Yeah, it's a very good point. I mean, it is a book about, as are most of my books, and probably anyone working in sustainability, ultimately what it's about is how do we transform our organizations, our society, our economies. And so it draws on a lot of those elements that you're describing, and it tries to present at least, my experience of dealing with bringing change about, as well as the research that's out there. I think what it does, I hope it does more effectively than has been done before, is it draws very strongly on systems theory, and tries to make it understandable. I mean, that's a very developed and mature science now, systems science. But for most people, it's just too complicated and they can't relate it. And I was always looking for the way to say, could we use some underlying principles, scientific principles of what makes a system flourish as a kind of guide to take us on this transition? And my attempt to do that are these 6 keys to thriving. And, I've tested it with a lot of different organizations and audiences, and it is a good sort of litmus test when you have a new strategy, or you're planning a new product, or, you're thinking about how to change. Is it taking you, is it aligned with these principles? I think it works quite well. I also do a lot of work with systems mapping, but more as an exercise in making people realize how connected everything is. The problem with systems mapping is as soon as you go beyond a very simple system, it becomes a spaghetti diagram, and then everybody just switches off because the world is very, very complex. So that's why going back to principles and using principles as a guide or a test is certainly, I think, a more productive approach. But for the rest, it draws on what we've learned about innovation, about resistance to change, all of these things. So it's not new in that sense. We've been trying to figure this out for many decades, and there are plenty of theories and practice around there. I must say that there is another book that I need to write, which is a book on change, because my sense still is that most of us have our own pet theories of change. It's based on probably where we've grown up and the subject or the discipline or the sort of field that we work in. And so we will have a way that we think change happens. And what I haven't seen out there is a book that really listens to all the different disciplines and how they understand change. So what if we asked a historian, how does change really happen? And then we brought in the insights of an ecologist, and then we compared that to a sociologist, and then we brought in, a biologist, and then, a psychologist. And I just think that would bring a much richer understanding of this central question that you brought up, which is how do systems or how do societies transition or organizations transition? So, yeah, I don't explicitly acknowledge that as a theory, but the whole book is really about that.
And I think mentioning that this different disciplines, I think you should even go beyond that. And that's about what perspectives we have on change. So if we have cultural perspectives on change, if we have a more liberal precautionary principle, it's typical. I think we are here with a group of precautionary principles. whereas other group of people, they don't think that way. And so change happens, and okay, what we're concerned about next 5 or 10 years, we don't look beyond that. And whereas the precautionary people look beyond that. And so and that's, you just mentioned something about being patient, but that's the interesting thing of what we always think is that we can only achieve the change needed when we feel the sense of urgency. And if there's no sense of urgency felt, people won't change. And that's what we encounter also in the bigger companies, the fossil fuel companies. They said like, okay, we have more time, we know that we have to change, but not yet. We still have time.
Yeah, which was that point I was making around, the dissatisfaction. People don't feel always that urgency. I think in the book I briefly mentioned a little model I use. I came up with really just from experience, and that's, for leaders to be successful in creating change, it's the 4 B's that they need. It's blue skies, which is being able to articulate that vision. It's big goals, so to be able to really be ambitious in making it concrete. It's baby steps, which is, showing that it's possible. But then the 4th one, which you've alluded to, I call burning platforms. They have to feel the heat. They have to experience something that gets them out of their comfort zone, forces them to move. I think in the book I write about, hearing the fire alarm at the gym and none of us reacting, like we don't see any smoke, we don't see any flames, so it's probably a false alarm. And that's sort of how we act in society and in organizations as well. So yeah, we need that urgency. And sometimes that means, making people aware of real emergencies or urgencies. Sometimes it means lighting the flame yourself, creating little emergencies, if you like. Certainly leaders do that a lot. Somebody like Elon Musk, which is a whole different subject, but he does that a lot. He creates, in fact, false senses of urgency and emergency. But good point. And I think also the cultural stuff would come out if you talk to anthropologists, sociologists, because that's very important. We don't see the world in the same way. We don't see change in the same way. In fact, in the West, we have a very goal-directed view of change. Even the idea of talking about transition, it's all about achievement and goals, and whereas in general, it's very much a generalization, but in general, the Eastern philosophies are very much more about being than doing. So it's about how you are in the world, in this moment, and whether you're at peace and adapting and so on. And that brings a very different view to change as well. Change is more about adapting than striving. So that's quite different.
I'm gonna add on that remark, asking, we live in a dominant neoliberal economic system, so we're part of rethinking economics. How can we change, or do we need to change the entire system? How do we do that? Because if you go into businesses, it's still about shareholders' wealth, profit maximization, and even companies that want to work on thriving, they are still facing their quarterly publications of their numbers. So any idea or any suggestions for that?
Yeah, the answer is we do need to change the system. And I think it needs to be an evolution rather than a revolution. Revolutions are overrated, I think. They're very messy, very damaging, and usually we just reinvent the same things. So every new system grows out of the old system. So we do need to start with what we've got. There's, besides the good work, which you'll be familiar with, Kate Raworth's great work on donut economics, I think that gives us a lot of clues. But I just finished a book by a friend and colleague, Stuart Hart. He's been a sustainability academic leading in this field for many, many decades, and he's written a book called Beyond Shareholder Primacy, Remaking Capitalism. It's actually just here on my desk, but you probably won't see it without it blurring. No. But anyway, Stuart Hart, and so there's a lot of advice in there. He's really gone into it in depth. A couple of insights I take from that. The one is that we sometimes think that the capitalism we've got, is almost impossible to change. It's almost like it's always been there, and how are we ever going to get something different? What he shows in this book is that capitalism has fundamentally changed at least twice before in history. And it's kind of a pendulum swing that happens. You get, a system that is more based on what he quotes, I think it's John Stuart Mill's, our better angels, and the other that swings to really focusing on what I think it was John Maynard Keynes called our animal spirits. So it's basically this, are you appealing to people's selfishness or to their sense of, community and responsibility? And in fact, we've had these big shifts over the last couple of centuries. And so that's the first point, is that it's absolutely not impossible for capitalism to change. In fact, it's probably inevitable, because history suggests that it does swing like a pendulum, and that when you go to an extreme, and certainly shareholder capitalism has been an extreme, neoliberal economics, you start to realize the cracks in the foundations there, and you start to look for and build an alternative. And he frames the alternative as sustainable capitalism. I think it doesn't matter what the label is in the end, but there are a couple of things he points to that need to change if it's going to work. Certainly, we need to change the way that we have constructed capital markets, and especially things like stock exchanges. So one of the examples he quotes, which is really interesting, there is an institution called the Long-Term Stock Exchange, and it's been designed and built on long-term investments that benefit society as much as the companies and the shareholders. So there are experiments around that. ESG, by the way, is for the most part shareholder capitalism in disguise. I would say shareholder primacy in disguise, which is one of the reasons it hasn't really worked. But the other that he points to is, we need to change how we reward companies, measure and reward companies, and so it has to be based on things like reinvestment. How much are they reinvesting, genuinely investing rather than extracting? For all the IPO listings we've had in the last decade or so, they've all been extractive. In other words, they've taken out more value than they've put in or created. So reinvestment, there have to be measures around innovation and so on. So he lists different ways to measure the performance of companies. I think what we're doing around sustainability reporting is a step in that direction, but we haven't quite cracked it in terms of, because we're really talking more about financial metrics have to change. There's nothing wrong with financial metrics. We just need to be measuring the right things financially. And of course, it's not quarterly returns. He talks also about needing to change the education system, because of course we've been educating next generation leaders in the same philosophy and ideology, really more than philosophy, of neoliberal economics. So teaching a different kind of economics and business management. And he gives some great examples of how that's possible. He was involved in completely redesigning an MBA in Vermont business school from scratch, so that sustainability is completely integrated. It's a sustainable innovation MBA. So, you know, there are various things that we can do to bring about that change in the economic system. But it doesn't happen in a vacuum. It doesn't. I've been involved, by the way, in what used to be called the New Economics movement for decades and decades. I set up the South African New Economics Foundation. I was very keyed into the work of the New Economics Foundation in London, and so I've been tracking the ideas for a long time. The problem is that a lot of that work has been pretty marginal ideas. You know, they latch onto one or two nice ideas. You know, alternative indicators. You know, we need something beyond GDP. Well, yes, we do, and now we've got plenty actually. We need to internalize externalities has been another of their big ideas, and yes, we need to do that, and we see more and more evidence that we are starting to do that in various areas. The problem is that it never sort of added up to a completely coherent alternative to what we have now, and so we really need to evolve what we have rather than
maybe an idea for a new book.
Yeah, maybe for somebody else to write. One of you in the room.
Yeah, look at the people in the room. Maybe. Yeah. We're getting closer to 9 p.m. here, so we're gonna have one more question and then. Yeah. George, your floor is yours. Thank you for answering that one. Yeah, last.
My name is George, and I'm not economic. I'm just entrepreneur. I was wondering, would it be possible, for instance, to regulate the market? I'm talking about the stock market in a way where investors have a ceiling, and when they on their profit, and when it exceeds the ceiling, it is would it be possible to have it like credit for the future for these investors on like interest-based investment, interest-based, because these they get their share out of the profit, and what exceeds that, it's reinvested in order to make the transition or make it easier for businesses to make the transition.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, it's a nice idea. I think that idea of incentivizing or maybe even forcing companies to invest the excess profits into something that will have a more long-term value creation. I think that's a good idea. The practical, you know, difficulty of doing that, especially on a stock market that really doesn't value any of those things, I think is difficult. And I mean, there are different ways that governments are trying to do this. So something like the windfall tax, of course, is a typical way. We have it here in the UK. So all the money that the oil and gas companies are making, a big percentage of those profits are being taken by the government to be reinvested in society, at least in theory. It would be better if that went directly into things like renewables. So it may be that, you know, governments find ways to force it through taxes. When companies are left to themselves under the current system, of course, it doesn't happen, because what we've seen is when they do make those extraordinary profits or they reach that ceiling you're talking about, what they're doing is really doing share buybacks and paying out to the shareholders. So, you know, that's not actually reinvesting in value creation. What we hoped would happen with all of the profits oil and gas is making at the moment is that they would use that to fund the transition, and in fact that hasn't happened. And that's where it comes down to what we haven't talked much about, which is the role of government. And I do think that we need a strong role for government. You know, even Adam Smith, who was famous for his free invisible hand of the free market, he was a moral philosopher. He wasn't an economist, and he assumed that government would, in a way, set the rules of the game, and that business would play within those rules. So I do think there's a strong role for government to try to ensure that companies are penalized for being too short-term and too extractive, and reward companies that are more strategic, more long-term, more investing in value creation for society. So a nice idea. Maybe that's one for the long-term stock exchange to take on board.
Okay, so thank you. Wayne, I think you're not only writing books about the economy, but you also write poems.
That is true.
So we're reaching the end of this conversation. There's one poem in particular at the end of your book, which is called Change the World. I understood that you would love to share that with us as a kind of conclusion of this session. So the floor is again yours.
So I'm very happy to do this. I'm just going to turn the light on because I'm disappearing in the dark, yeah?
I do that here too, so you see a bit more of the people. Careful, because it's going to be very light in the beginning, and I'm going to make it a bit less light. Okay.
Okay, but you all have a choice now. You're going to have to vote. So there's Change the World that you've all read in the book. So that would be to refresh you on that poem. I've done part 2 of Change the World, which is another sort of a second evolution.
Part 2.
So hands up if you want part 2, which you won't have heard before. It looks like it might be split. Hands up if you want part 1, which is in the book. Okay, I think part 2. Okay. I mean, you will recognize the style of it from what's in the book as well, because it really is an extension of the poem. Let me just find it quickly. I'll also just because it's come up in my search, I'll mention to you. There's one that is on my Substack called The Book of Changes. So if you're interested in this whole idea of change and in a way poetry related to change, then you should check that out, or I can share it with you. I'll give you a little taste of that one before I do Change the World. The first part starts like this. It says, "This is the time of transition, the rhyme of revision, on the cusp between dying and being reborn, the dawn of new light, the fight of contraction and deep breathing, of conviction and deep grieving, on the cusp between pain and promise, the rhyme of rain and conflagration, this is the time of expectation." And it goes on. But that wasn't what I was going to read you. So, okay, Change the World Part 2.
Big applause for Wayne.
Well, I got to do it first. So, let's change the world. Let's move it. Let's chance it and free dance it. Let's feel its sliding rhythms, the echoes of its rhymes, the calling of our times, with signs of stars aligning, with mimes of joy and madness, of syncopated sadness, because we bend, because we tend to lose the beat, then find it, to live life forward, not rewind it. Let's stamp our feet, link arms and say, we'll change the world today. Let's change the world, invoke it. Let's weave it and conceive it. Let's sing our songs of freedom, the myths of heroes' quests, the trial by fire tests, with rests to ease our struggle, with crests that draw us onward, because we roam, because we've shown with tears and wide-eyed wonder, these days are not for squander. Let's choose our narrative to say, we changed the world today. Let's change the world, let's heed it, let's hear it and not fear it. Let's place our finger on life's pulse, where mountain rivers flow, where ancient forests grow. We know, for elders tell us, we grow by seeing what can be, because within we find our gin and rub each deep desire, from sparks into bright flames of fire. Let's wish for every chance to say, I changed the world today. There you go. I think you're the first audience to hear that.
Thank you so much. In the name of Rethinking Economics, EBBC, and you still want to say something? Go ahead.
No, just thank you all. Thank you for being there and for taking the time to read the book and interact with me. And I just invite you all to be, ambassadors for thriving in the world, be part of the movement.
And how are you?
Thank you very much. And thanks for
We hope to
organizing.
see you in Antwerp somewhere October, November for a beer. We are good in drinking beer or something else.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Have a great evening. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.